information is not the same thing as truth. A lot of people think that if we're just sort of flooded with more information, that somehow the truth is going to rise to the surface, and that that's going to be how we determine what's true or false. But what tends to happen is that all of this information crowds up the truth, and you can't see it because there's too much information for you to sort through. So what I mean by truth is a logical proposition that corresponds with reality. A sentence that you can sort of verify whether it's true or false by simply looking at the words in a proposition and seeing if they correspond with reality. The nouns would correspond with things, the verbs would correspond with actions, the adjectives with qualities and whatnot. And so when you check a proposition, you can observe whether or not it's true or false. And therefore, the truth, the capital T truth, is simply a collection of all the propositions that have been accurately and precisely matched to reality. The truth could look like a book, right? Imagine a book of all the propositions about the entire world, and that would be the book of truth. No such book exists, of course, because the book would be infinitely long, right? There's so many propositions having to describe the world. But some of the characteristics of this truth would be that truth is complex. It's not black and white. There's a lot of shades of gray. There's a lot of colors. There's a lot of degrees of truth complexity that you have to understand. It requires us to carefully examine what's true and what's false. It often conflicts with our wishes and our desires as well. That what we want to be true isn't always the case. And so sometimes we just want things to be true, but they're not, and the truth likes to slap us in the face once in a while. Objective truth is consistent, fixed, and independently verifiable. That's one of the great things about philosophy, is that I don't have to tell you what's true. You can figure it out as well. You can go and look at the evidence and see whether or not it's true. And it's true no matter what. That is, even if you don't believe it, it's still going to be truth out there. Objective reality is something that is true, independent of what you believe. Conspiracy theories are claims of objective truth. They're not asking for people's opinions. They're not asking whether or not you like vanilla or mint chocolate chip ice cream. They're not asking if you like Justin Bieber, right? The conspiracy theory is making a statement about the way the world is, and we can verify that, we can check that with the data. Whereas when you compare truth to fiction, right? Fiction is sort of the opposite of these things. Fiction is simple. Oh, aliens did it, right? Oh, it was the Illuminati, okay? Fiction fits with our interests and our desires. It's exciting, it's engaging. Fiction is easy. You just make things up, right? This cup is blue. 2 + 2 = unicorns. Justin Bieber's a good artist, right? These things are just made up, okay? And so our human tendency is simply to make judgments about things based on our ways of thinking. And there are different ways that we do this that conflict with the truth. One of those is called the anchoring bias, where when we hear something for the first time, we judge all other future claims based on what we first hear. And then we compare them to that. So there's this judgment that comes in from what you may have heard when you were a child, or maybe what you heard from your friends. The first experience becomes the bar by which you judge all other experiences. So if you first heard that the Earth was only 6,000 years old, then you're probably going to question anyone who says something different than that. Not because of any evidence or because of any logical reasoning, but because that's the first thing that you heard. So it becomes sort of a litmus test for what you think is true or false. Another way of thinking that we oftentimes fall prey to is ad populum, which is just a fancy way of saying that we tend to believe what most people believe. So if most people think that something is true, we tend to conform to that because we're like, well, if they all believe it, then surely it must be true. Therefore, I will tend to believe it. And yet, a lot of times we get this wrong. This doesn't tend to track the truth. The vast majority of people can be wrong about things. Here are some examples, right? Most people believe that the moon only comes out at night. It doesn't. In fact, it's about to set right now. It's been out all day, and you just didn't notice it. Or that AD means after death. It doesn't. Or that Justin Bieber is a good singer. He's not. These are false claims. And yet there are a whole bunch of people out there who believe them to be true. So you see that sometimes our way of thinking lends itself to a falsehood. Another fallacy that we are prone to is called the exposure effect, where we tend to believe things because we hear it more often. And so therefore, we just accept it. This happens when we're on YouTube or on Google, and suddenly we're on Facebook or Twitter or Snapchat. Any one of the social media programs is probably going to feed you the same tweet that one person said, but because you hear it retweeted by everyone else, you think it's got to be true because everyone's saying it. It was just one person. And yet we think that because we hear it more often, that means that it must be true. And we tend to remember it in that sense, right? Because it's constantly being embedded, right? We were just talking about this in logic, that sometimes marketing schemes will try to keep repeating commercials one after another, just so that you can remember that jingle or that fact or whatever it is that they're claiming, just so that it's embedded in your memory, regardless of whether or not the statement is true or false. A fourth kind of fallacy that we are prone to is called personal bias. You could also call this confirmation bias. It's the tendency to accept beliefs that agree with your beliefs and to reject those beliefs that contradict or conflict with your current beliefs. So we're always sort of sifting through the data, trying to decide what's true or false. And we pick the stuff that fits with our beliefs because it's more fun that way, right? We don't have to admit we're wrong and make corrections. We don't have to investigate the truth and see what's right or wrong. We just simply go with whatever fits what we already believe to be true. And so it makes us, whatever makes us look good or makes other people look evil, these are things that are going to resonate with us because we want to feel good. We want other people to be demonized, right? It just fits with our dispositions. We tend to choose information that's most interesting to us. So when you do a Google search and they give you a list of options of what to choose from, whether it's YouTube videos or links to click on, you're probably going to pick on the link that's most interesting to you, not the one that's factually based or the one that's that boring old news like this isn't really a true conspiracy theory. You're prone to click on the link that is most interesting to you, thus sort of radicalizing yourself by choosing the stuff that's the most glamorous, right? And then Google will sense that you picked that one, and it will start feeding you that more often. YouTube does this, Google does this, Snapchat does this. They're all feeding you information based on what you clicked before this. So therefore, this personal bias is combined with the exposure effect and the ad populum fallacy to make people think that if they are inundated with all this information, that information must be true, and I'm here to say it's not. Search engines on the internet are the epitome of confirmation bias. And yet people use those search engines to do their research for what's true and false. Do you not see the problems here? That we are being fed an algorithm that's constantly giving you what it thinks you want to hear, and we are then drawing conclusions based on that computer's algorithm. And most of us do it. How many people think that whatever they saw on Snapchat or YouTube is the truth? They think this is the news, right? Even if it's a conspiracy theory, someone just made up and posted to their Instagram account. So let's talk about what a conspiracy theory is. And I want to start by trying to define some of these terms so that we can just get on the same page. The first thing to note is that a conspiracy doesn't have a single definition. So there's a problem here in trying to examine this, right? What I will point out is that for every definition that has been proposed by philosophers and academics alike to try to figure out what a conspiracy is, they tend to have two basic characteristics. One of those characteristics is secrecy. So each of the definitions say that a conspiracy is done in secret behind closed doors, and no one knows it's going on. Now, the reason why that's important is because if it's done in secret, how do you prove that it's false? How would you know if it's false? You see the problem here. That if something is really happening in secret, we're not supposed to be in the know. So if there is a conspiracy, it's very hard to prove that it's false. because if it's done in secret and it's successful, no one's supposed to know. So that's a key part of the conspiracy theory. It's impossible to prove if a secret plot is really happening. So we just have to look for evidence to see if there's any information or evidence that slipped through the cracks. The second quality that is common within each of these definitions of conspiracy is its malicious nature, that it's doing something bad against the common good. And that's what makes it a conspiracy. A bunch of people plotting together to do something bad in secret against the common good, the rest of us. And so we don't want to just necessarily say that a conspiracy theory is true or false, but we want to look at whether or not these conspiracies have evidence. A conspiracy theory, therefore, is an explanation of past or ongoing events that cites as its main cause a group of powerful persons who are acting in secret for their own benefit and against the common good. That's a conspiracy theory. Notice that it is an explanation of these events. It's not a fact, it's not a single thing, it's an interpretation of what's going on, and it's more complex than a simple true or false statement. So we can point out that a conspiracy theory is simply a belief in a conspiracy, which may be true or false. Some conspiracies are true and some conspiracies are false, and it usually conflicts with the popular explanation. This is what everyone else believes. So the question we're looking at here is to try to figure out which conspiracies are true and which ones are false. And we don't want to be too dismissive in this case, because if we dismiss all conspiracies as false, then it's easier for conspirators to get away with stuff, because we're all just dismissing it. That's nonsense. So we don't want to jump to conclusions. It's not like all conspiracies are true or all conspiracies are false. Some of them are true and some of them are false. And it's our job to weed through the data to try to figure out what's going on in reality, to expose that secret plot. But that's very challenging, because if it's done successfully, we don't have any evidence of it. So that leaves us with this choice. Are we going to believe it without evidence? And is that rational? You see the dilemma here. So Joseph Kuczynski, who writes a lot of the books on conspiracy theory, a political scientist from Miami University, says that we shouldn't really regard conspiracy theories as true or false, but rather as probable or improbable. Because all conspiracy theories have a positive probability of being true, right? Think of the difference as something like this, right? If we were to draw a spectrum between the things that are impossible and the things that are like 100% true, right? There are degrees between that, between 0% true and 100% true, right? The degrees, or the realm of possibility, covers that whole spectrum except for the 0% part, right? So the realm of possibility would be anything from 1% to 100%. And there are degrees of probability in between. When somebody says it's possible we faked 9/11, they're pointing to the side and saying, this area here is part of the realm of possibility, therefore you have to take me seriously, without looking at the levels of plausibility. So there are degrees of plausibility. We could say that this area here are the claims that are less probable, and this area here is the area where the claims are more plausible. There's a lot more evidence. And the thing that distinguishes between these is the amount of evidence that supports them. So you're really talking about people discussing the possibility of a conspiracy going on, and that could be anything from like only 1% plausible to 99% plausible. But there are degrees of plausibility that depend on the evidence. So what determines the amount of plausibility has mainly to do with how much evidence supports it. Remember that it is possible for conspiracies to be real, and we can't discount that. There are conspiracies that are true, and we don't want to just jump to the conclusion. Or to use Kuczynski's language, some conspiracies are more probable than others. Here's a list of conspiracies that have actually occurred. So we can't just say that all conspiracy theories are false. There are ones that are real, and we need to take them serious. When conspiracy theories get a fair treatment and receive serious attention, the likelihood of a successful conspiracy declines because we are on the watch. We are being those watchdogs, checking things out and blowing the whistle when we see something amiss. Every one of us has got to learn these techniques to be able to identify which conspiracy theories are true and which ones are false. In fact, there's been a lot of data that shows that conspiracy theories are a lot like rumors, gossip, right? People can pass things around without showing any proof for it, saying, something that's usually negative, information passed between people that is just spread by word of mouth. They're not offering any evidence for it. So imagine that I just simply make up that you cheated on an exam. What's the first thing you're going to say in response to me? What's your evidence, right? Why are you saying that? And so I had better show you proof of the cheating. Otherwise, what I'm saying is just simply made up. I could just simply assume that you're cheating in my class and give you an F, but that wouldn't be a good teacher. It wouldn't be a good, responsible citizen of the world. So we have to watch out that sometimes these rumors are passed around with little or no proof. And oftentimes they are accepted without any evidence to support them. You just heard your friend say it, but you believe it. Or I just happened to see this on Instagram, and you believed it. You didn't bother to question it. So each of us should become skilled in identifying what makes a conspiracy theory true or false. And I'd like to point out 7 different characteristics or 7 different techniques for evaluating a conspiracy theory. This is what we all need to get good at. Some people think that all you have to do is look at the evidence for and against, and that's it. But it's more complicated than that. It's how you arrange this evidence that matters. There are facts that are unquestionable, tried and true. They've been tested, and they stand the test. But conspiracy theories are usually a collection of statements, all of which working together, and you have to sort through not only whether or not each statement is true, but whether or not they're actually connected to each other. So it requires a lot more work than just simply fact-checking. So therefore, we are going to have to evaluate the interpretation of a conspiracy theory, not just the facts that support it. So one of the first things you can do is to consider all of the alternative explanations. When somebody says a rumor to you, you need to ask, what else could this be about? Maybe they're not thinking about it right. Maybe something else is happening here. Look at all the possible explanations that could account for what happened, especially if it's something dramatic, like a police shooting, or a tragedy like 9/11, Sandy Hook, or even something like a natural disaster, right? If somebody comes to you and says, I don't think this pandemic was real, I think it was planned, you need to consider what the options are and compare each of those, because if you don't look at all of the alternatives, you might be missing the one that's true. But if you just take one explanation and assume that's true without reflecting about what it would look like compared to the others, you may be making a mistake in reasoning. We are likely to choose an explanation that is the most interesting to us. So again, it's our natural inclination to accept a story that's more exciting, more thrilling, more engaging. Again, that doesn't lead to the truth. We also have to check it with the evidence. Obviously, this means we are collecting data. And it's not the same thing as interpretation, right? You're collecting data to see what facts are out there, but then you're piecing that together to form the conspiracy theory. So you have to examine what's really going on. And when an event occurs, we have to see who are the people who are collecting this data. A lot of people who spread conspiracy theories are doing it from their home at a computer or in front of a television set. So when there is a police shooting, people are then asserting things about what they think happened from their couches at home. But the people that are first on the scene are the people who are the eyewitnesses. They can collect data. And who is the first people on the scene? Police officers, eyewitnesses, journalists who are going to investigate this. They're there on the ground gathering that data for us. We want to look at each one of their perspectives because they're sharing with us what they see as some of this data. And notice that each of those might be biased, right? You might say, well, the police have sort of a more conservative bias, or the journalists are more liberal bias. But notice that if you're listening to both the police and you're listening to the journalists, you can start to piece together where the truth lies in between there, because each of them may have their own personal bias. But by examining all of the evidence, you're piecing together what's true or false. What do conspiracy theorists tend to do? They tend to jump to a conclusion from their couch without even doing the research. Without even hearing what happened, people were saying after Sandy Hook that they thought that this was all a false flag, right? That it was all staged. They had no reasons to accept that other than that they thought that it could be possibly a false flag operation. When the assassination attempt on Trump's life occurred, people started jumping to conclusions about it. Social media was ablaze with explanations for what they thought really happened there. But they had just learned about the incident. And going on nothing more than that they heard gunshots in the distance, and suddenly Trump was bleeding and then drops to the ground, they were somehow able to deduce that that was an inside job by the Biden administration. I mean, Biden can't even successfully walk up a staircase. You think he can coordinate that kind of attack? Or when a pandemic occurs, people jump to the conclusion that this was all staged by either the US government or the Chinese government. And suddenly, everyone's simply presenting this inscrutable proof as if it's definitive without looking at the details. And notice how many times they change their story with confidence. So the first story you hear in the pandemic was, COVID-19 isn't real. There's no virus. This is a fake. Then they start saying, well, it's real, but it's not dangerous. So we don't need to wear masks. Then they say, oh, well, maybe it's a problem, but it's not serious, right? And everyone gets the flu, right? Then they start saying, no, it's a bioweapon engineered by the Chinese so they can kill off all the other countries, but we still don't have to wear masks. You see the problems here, right? The story keeps changing as if they're uncovering truth, but they're just making up reasons for why they think it. And this is what leads people to say, I don't know what to believe anymore. My mom just said that to me on the phone a couple nights ago. She says, Brian, I don't know who to trust. Because I hear one thing from social media, I hear another thing from the mainstream media, I hear other things from politicians. Like, who do you trust anymore? And yet they go on to trust whatever's on their social media account, right? People will just, blindly say, I don't trust the mainstream media, but I'll trust whoever, some random person on Twitter, or some random person on Facebook. And when people say they don't know who to trust anymore, they oftentimes just go with their feelings. But as I just indicated, your feelings are not a good litmus test for what's true or false, right? Your feelings can get it wrong. So you get this generation of people saying, well, I'm just being flooded with information. I'm just going to go with whatever I want to be true. And now you've lost touch with reality. This leads people to a more nihilistic worldview, where they don't think anything is true. Nihilism makes people more prone to conspiratorial thinking because there's nothing to anchor your beliefs to. If you don't believe in truth, then what's the point in evaluating the evidence to see if it's true? You should believe whatever you want. No wonder conspiracy theories are becoming more prominent in this day and age. You also need to check for bias. Like I said, when you hear a report, ask who's saying it. What's their bias? Why are they saying it? Look at both sides of an issue. Try to examine all the possible explanations. So it's helpful for you to recognize that, yes, sure, the media is biased. But so is social media, so are politicians, so are your friends, so are your family, so are you. The trick is not to look for unbiased sources, it's to be able to recognize bias and to be able to see through it. So sometimes when you hear different points of view, look at what each people are saying, and if they agree, then you can say there's more probability to that, because people who normally would be at odds with one another would help you to see what the facts are. So in the last election, there were a lot of people claiming that the election was a fraud, that it didn't really work out in Biden's favor. But there is a conservative organization known as the Heritage Foundation, which is known for investigating cases of voter fraud. And they have investigated 85 cases of illegal voting over the past 21 years. 85 cases. If there were more cases, they would be looking for them and exposing them. But they can only find 85 cases. Is that enough to oversway an election? No. So you can see that here, there's an organization whose goal is to try to expose voter fraud, and even they are admitting that there's no sure signs that there is a clear voter fraud going on. And think about how often you can fact check a conspiracy theory with other people's perspectives. So let's go to the moon landing for a second, right? So you guys know that in the 1960s, America and the USSR are locked in a space race to be the first country to get to the moon. You might also believe that, or you might know, that Russia has the capability to track vessels that are traveling through space. They can do it themselves, right? So they can monitor what's happening in space. And yet somehow people believe that the moon landing was faked. Folks, if Russia has the capacity to track the Apollo missions, then they would have called it out as fake had they seen that. But they didn't. They congratulated America on being the first people to make it to the moon. So you can use this bias as a way of looking at what's true and false by saying they have a reason to want to expose American conspiracies, but yet the Russians didn't. So you can then see that even they agreed that it was not a fake mission. Or how about this one, right? Many people believe that the media is biased toward a liberal agenda, out to slander Republicans every chance that they get. They may also believe that 9/11 is an inside job conducted by George W. Bush, a Republican. And yet, the mainstream media did nothing to implicate Bush of an inside job during 9/11. So you can see that if there is a bias there in the media, as people project there is, and if that bias would want them to expose a conspiracy like the government staged 9/11, then wouldn't they do that to expose a Republican president? But yet they didn't. You see what I'm getting at? Checking for bias helps you to sort out what's true and false, and you can start to weed out what's true by reflecting on what people's bias are, so that you can start piecing this together. That then requires you to start connecting things together. Connecting the dots is a phenomenon that a lot of conspiracies will fall prey to in a way that is made up, right? And so we have to test these connections. You probably have seen this before, right? Credit to Julie Hernandez for giving this. This is data, okay? You have a bunch of data points that are all sort of out there in space. When you start to organize those into certain categories, the green and the gray, and you can say, that's information, right? Now you're starting to categorize your data. Once you start drawing connections between those data points, you get knowledge, right? You start to say, oh yeah, these data points are connected in some way. When you start making connections from one data point to another and say, oh yeah, those two things are connected, that's an insight to help you understand what's true and false. And when you notice that there's a pathway that gets you from one data point to another data point, you can then start calling that wisdom, right? You know how to get to the second data point. The conspiracy theorists end up with this, right? Now, what I like about this meme is that it shows you the data points at first, and notice that a conspiracy theorist can interpret those data points however they want. And if you see a unicorn, then that's what you're going to think is the data shows. So I think this is how our human brains work in trying to look at data. We're searching for our own explanation. And if unicorns are your favorite animal, mystical animal, fake animals. Sorry, disappoint those who are believers. Then you might see the data with your interest, with your bias, with your perspective in mind. So when we look at data, we need to see if it's truly connected, and that requires us to do a lot of testing to see whether or not these points are connected, and to compare those with coincidences, right? So you've probably seen a lot of coincidences. Some people think that there are no coincidences. Everything is intentional. Really? Let's try some, okay? Some of you may know this. Mark Twain was born in 1835, the same year that Halley's Comet appeared. And then he died in 1910, the year that the comet next appeared. Coincidence? Or some of you have probably heard the famous trope about Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, both of whom died on the same day, July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after each had signed the Declaration of Independence. And so, is this coincidence? Furthermore, James Madison died 5 years later on the 55th anniversary of signing the Declaration. Some of you guys know what the Amazon logo looks like? Did you know it looks like this guy? Coincidence? And this is really going to freak some of you out. If you open a Word document and type the letters NYC, and then you go up to the font and you change the font to Wingdings, this is what you get. Coincidence? You see the problem, right? That's freaking some people out, isn't it, right? Some of you are like, you can go on. I tried it last night. I got these screenshots. It's freaky, but is that intentional, or is that just simply coincidence? After all, they had to come up with 3 letters that had those symbols on Wingdings. Well, what does Wingdings have? Why did they create this? So connecting the dots can be simply a coincidence. We need to, we'll contrast that later on. We also want to check for its consistency, right? Notice that one of the characteristics of truth is that truth tends to be consistent. It doesn't change the story. It's sensitive. If it's true, it tends to stay that way. And yet, a lot of conspiracy theories are always changing the storyline. So let me share with you the development of the lizard people conspiracy theory. You probably have heard this at some point. This started in the early 1900s when people were writing books. The Shadow Kingdom was one of them, where he claims in the book that there are these shape-shifting humanoid lizard people living among us, working in the shadows to manipulate us. Well, then just a few years later, someone writes the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, the Atlantean, where he claims that actually these alien lizard people lived billions of years before us and then evolved into the human race. And they are our proto-ancestors, creating a pseudo-history of Earth. Then just a few years later, G. Warren Shufelt made a claim that there were lizard people living underground in hidden tunnels, manipulating people from underneath us, and that no one could find these tunnels. In fact, here's the funny thing about Shufelt. He actually invented what he called an X-ray machine that could look into the earth and find where there was gold, because that's where the lizard people were hiding. They were trying to get our gold from underneath us. This device was actually not an X-ray machine. It was actually just a pendulum held by Shufelt. This is the device he used. It's actually just a can with a pendulum hanging from it that he's holding and claiming that when it moves a certain direction, he could find where the tunnels were, where the gold was. He actually convinced the Los Angeles government to allow him to start digging, and he did so, and they dug 300 feet and found water. So he was successful in finding a well, but nothing else. In fact, after they did this experiment, he never used the device again to find gold. So if he thought it worked, why didn't he do it elsewhere? didn't, because he knew it was false. Then we get to the 12th planet. This is a book that claims that lizard people came from outer space to create the human race and seed this planet with humanoid beings whom they can then manipulate. And around that same time, David Icke starts presenting his conspiracy theory that he is the son of a lizard god that exists in space, and claims that the moon was a spaceship and that reality is actually just a dream being broadcast from the moon. Now, he later transformed or changed his story to claim that the dream actually wasn't coming from the moon. It was actually emanating from the planet Saturn, using the moon as a broadcast satellite. Oh, that makes a lot more sense. Thank you, David Icke. And here's the funny thing is, these lizard people, who they have been keeping secret for all of these millennia, are ruling the world and manipulating governments and keeping themselves secretly hidden from all of us, but they can't stop 6 guys from writing books about them. If the story keeps changing, that's a sign that no one really knows what the truth is. They're just making things up. So we also need to compare the alternative explanations to each other and see which one of them holds the most plausibility. Suppose I gave you 2 different stories about George Floyd's death. Which one are you going to believe? The first one you hear? How do you know which one of those stories is true? When we are informed about an event, we jump to conclusions, and that's usually what we stick with because we don't want to admit that we're wrong. So the key question is, how do you tell the difference between a coincidence and a conspiracy? Princess Diana died by a car wreck involving a drunk driver. Or did she? If everything can be true, if every conspiracy theory can be considered true based on its possibility, then there are no coincidences. But of course that can't be correct. Clearly things happen by coincidence. Things happen randomly. So when your cat goes missing, what's the first thing you think of? You might think, oh, someone stole my cat, ate it. Now walk through the possible explanations for this, right? Explanation number 1. The cat simply went missing. You need to check your basement. Explanation number 2. Someone grabbed your cat and then started gnawing on the cat right then and there. In order for that explanation to have any plausibility, someone would have had to have seen it. So I'm picturing someone standing in Ohio, just pick a random state, and they see their pet there in the lawn, and someone walks up, grabs the cat, and just starts gnawing away on it, right? First of all, that's not how people eat animals, right? And they would have to, rip off the fur and all this stuff. If you're going to eat an animal, you need to first kill it, not eat it while it's still alive. Then you need to skin it, and you need to cook it, right? There's a whole process there. And if somebody's taking your cat and gnawing on that, I think the first thing you're going to do is whip out your phone and start taking pictures of it, right? And yet no pictures have surfaced. Explanation number 3, someone grabbed your cat and then started to skin it right there and cook it in front of you. Again, you have plenty of time to pull out your phone and start filming this, or call the cops and say, someone is currently killing my cat and skinning it and cooking it in front of me. Please help. And yet, no one did this. Explanation number 4, someone then grabbed your cat and took it home to eat it. All right, in this case, you don't have evidence of the eating unless you followed them to their house. And if you've done that, you've had ample time to take pictures, film them, call the cops, call your neighbors, and expose them. But yet, no such evidence emerged. Furthermore, you can check, so that's checking the evidence of the case, right? By the way, the woman who actually started this rumor apologized and admitted that her cat was actually home the whole time. It was in her basement. You can also check for bias, right? If you don't trust the media, then look at the people who are on the scene. The Republican mayor asked people to stop spreading these stories because he said there was no evidence of them. The Republican governor asked people to stop spreading these stories because he said there was no evidence to support them. The Republican lawmakers in Congress asked people to stop spreading these stories because they said there was no evidence to back them. Republican citizens of Springfield, Ohio asked people to stop spreading these stories because it was creating so much negative press in their home state, in their home cities. So don't just trust the biased sources. If you think that someone's trying to cover up a conspiracy, look at the people who have a bias that would favor the conspiracy. And if they're saying it's false, you need to recognize the plausibility is pretty low there. And then you can evaluate the plausibility. So here's some characteristics of a conspiracy compared to characteristics of a coincidence. And this should help you to see the difference between them. The characteristics of a conspiracy include that it was pre-planned, that it is intentional, it is malevolent, as we pointed out earlier. It usually involves multiple people. This prevents us from just saying that a lone wolf mass murderer is a conspiracy. That's not. It's just a murderer. And it's always done in secret, right? So this is what a conspiracy is. When we compare that to a coincidence, the coincidence is accidental. The coincidence is unintentional. The coincidence is random. And I would also add to that that it's not necessarily malevolent, although it could be. Sometimes coincidences happen that are bad. And that it may or may not be public. That doesn't matter. My point is that you can tell the difference between them. So what I want to do is to play a game. I want to ask, is the following statements that I make a coincidence or a conspiracy? Are you ready? It's a game show. You ready? All right. You tell me, are these conspiracies or coincidence? 9/11, the Al-Qaeda version. Conspiracy or coincidence? Here's some conspiracies, right? Why? Because it was intentional, it was deliberate, it was pre-planned, it was malevolent, and it was done in secret. How about Sandy Hook? Coincidence or conspiracy? Hearing more conspiracies, although there were fewer at that time, right? But yet you can see that this was something that was intentional, it was malevolent, it was done in secret. It's not a conspiracy because it wasn't done by multiple people, and it wasn't done in secret. That's just a mass shooter. Joe Biden's resignation as the 2024 Democratic nominee. Was this pre-planned? Was it intentional? Was it malevolent? Was it done in secret? Mark Twain's birthday, coinciding with Halley's Comet. Coincidence, right? That just happens to be the case. I don't think anybody tried to orchestrate that. Given the vast number of people who are born every year, people who were born in the year of Halley's Comet, surely somebody may have born and died at the two comings of Halley's Comet. The NYC wingdings thing. Coincidence, right? I mean, they had to choose 3 letters. Whatever the other 3 letters would have been, you would probably be finding some malevolent thing about that, right? It's just a coincidence that occurred there. Abe Lincoln's assassination. Conspiracy, right? This was planned, it was intentional, it was malevolent, it was done in secret. Hurricane Helene hits America during an election year. Right? Seems like a coincidence. Hurricanes happen every year. Of course there are going to be hurricanes that happen during an election year. COVID-19 becomes a pandemic during an election year. Come on, right? You see the problem. Viruses mutate every year. That's why we have to keep getting a different vaccine. And it's inevitable that a virus will mutate in a way that becomes deadly to people. some of you may be noticing that on my previous slide, all of the bullet points started with the letter C. Coincidence? When a conspiracy becomes too grand to become true, it's less likely to be plausible. Brian Keeley is a philosophy professor at Pitzer College in California. He suggests that conspiracy theories should be considered less true the bigger it becomes. So you have to ask yourself this question: how many people would have to be behind the 9/11 conspiracy theory? Not only would it be the 19 people who flew the planes into the World Trade Center, it'd have to be all of the passengers, it'd have to be the airlines who ran those planes and covered up the planes and allowed them to be used as missiles, the governments, of course, who conducted this, all of the people who were investigating it, both the CIA and the FBI, and all the journalists who were fact-checking that with them, and all the people who were implicated in that, the police force, the NYC firefighters, all of these people, not to mention all of the fact-checkers like the independent universities and organizations that were trying to investigate 9/11 to see if it was done the way the popular explanation says it was. And they all come to the same conclusion. How many people would have to be involved in Princess Diana's death if that was staged? Both the English government and the French government performed independent investigation into Princess Diana's death, and both of them concluded that it was death by car wreck due to drunk driving. England and France hate each other, but yet they somehow agreed on this. How many people would be involved if the moon landing was fake? So you're not only talking about NASA, you're talking about government officials who approved this, the people who recorded it, Stanley Kubrick, who apparently put it all to videotape and showed it to the people. The astronauts themselves would be involved, all the people who worked on the project would have to be involved. And if Russia has the ability to monitor whether or not there are space vehicles going to the moon and back, even the Russians would have to be involved in it. So you see what starts to happen is that people start to attribute everyone's involved in the conspiracy. At which point, I have to say, how do governments as polar opposite as the United States and Russia work together to conduct a grand conspiracy without anyone blowing a whistle? No one has stepped forward. It's not like the conspiracy theorists are saying that there's a whistleblower admitting, hey, I was in it, I filmed the Stanley Kubrick video. They're just making up things that sound possible and claiming that it's somehow plausible. And that's why I think a lot of conspiracy theories are getting bigger as they are perpetuated on social media. If one conspiracy theory can be proven true simply because it's possible to have occurred, then all conspiracy theories must be true on that same grounds. So I want to share a secret with you. Be respectful, stay reminded. I want you to know that the US government killed 12 billion birds between the years of 1959 and 2001 in a government attempt to try to spy on the American citizenry. Therefore, birds are not real. Hashtag Poultrygate. They're government drones. The word bird means bureaucratic informational research drone. Wake up. And they spend their time on power lines, right? Recharging their batteries. The saying goes, if it flies, it spies. They use liquid tracking devices that they drop on your car so they can follow you everywhere you go. Have you ever seen a baby pigeon? I've never seen a baby pigeon. Every state has a state bird associated with it. Politicians don't talk, they tweet. Twitter's logo is a bird. And bird watching goes both ways. don't even get me started on the narwhal conspiracy theory. Thank you very much.